Welcome to Seminar 8 in the series Exploring the Bible. Thank you for your interest. I hope you are as interested at the end or more interested than you are at the beginning. During these seminars, we've been looking at the many reasons there are to trust that the Bible is a record of God's words and that we can trust the Bible. Today we have another of those reasons. Modern public health regulations in God's law. Now maybe that sounds a bit funky to you, but absolutely that's what there is in the Bible. So let's go. First of all, some context. The Bible is the story of God and people. In the Old Testament, the story is centered in a man God selected and his family that became a nation, Israel. The Old Testament narrative tracks their development and history for approximately 2,000 years. God provided a body of law to that nation, which has been preserved and enables modern critical study. That law was designed to provide success, security, and safety for both individuals and the nation. Subjects included in that law were, first of all, religious worship, but all areas of human life were included, such as defense, health and hygiene, employment, culture and festivals, property, and public safety. In the public health area, this is some of the topics that are included in God's legislation that He gave them. Infection prevention and management, food safety, treatment of mould and mildew, sanitation. And a study of these legislative provisions shows them to be far ahead of the science of the time. As you'll see, some of the science, as we know it, is only less than 200 years old. But here we're talking 3,500 years ago. The public health provisions in God's law to His people, for me at least, provide interesting insights given the COVID-19 2020 pandemic experience that we are all in the middle of. The world has had to come to grips with lockdown, social distancing, travel restrictions, even washing the groceries. Many people have lost their lives. Many have lost their jobs, and there will be significant economic consequences in future years from all of this. Quarantine, social isolation bubbles, hand washing and lockdown featured in God's law 3,500 years ago. So first of all, I just want to do a little philosophy thing here. The purpose of law, and I went fishing around on the internet and found this one. The law serves many purposes. Four principal ones are establishing standards, maintaining order, resolving disputes, and protecting liberties and rights. So what do we think of as our liberties and rights? And for me, an expectation of good quality public health and safety is what I expect the law and the government of New Zealand to provide for me and for the community as a whole. So take that idea. What was God's law to do? So just looking at God's law, a man called Moses was the leader of Israel at the time. A pretty dodgy, difficult job. He brought God's law to the people. And Moses said about the law that God had given him, "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' What other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" So would you say that of the laws of the country that you live in? For me personally, mostly. But Moses is reminding the people of Israel that God's law is righteous because it comes from God. Centuries later, Jesus Christ said that the overriding principle of that law was God's love for his people. That's a different factor. That isn't in the law of wherever you're sitting. Love for others. Although the principles are there, in return, the people of Israel were to love God and their neighbour. And I've been quite intrigued with this. In 2020, during the pandemic, the Prime Minister of New Zealand has encouraged the love your neighbour ethos by repeatedly using the simple words, "Be kind." That is a very pithy statement of love your neighbour as yourself, which started with the Lord God. So we're going to read first. I'll do all the readings because it's too difficult when there's no physical bodies in front of me. Find Leviticus, which is the third book from the beginning of your Bible. Chapter 13. Straight in, we're going to look at how God gave them simple procedures to control infection from spreading. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When anyone has a swelling or a rash or a bright spot on his skin that may become an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on his skin. And if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is an infectious skin disease. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. If the spot on his skin is white but does not appear to be more than skin deep and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine him. And if he sees that the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he is to keep him in isolation another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine him again. And if the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a rash. The man must wash his clothes and he will be clean. But if the rash does spread in his skin after he has shown himself to the priest to be pronounced clean, he must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine him, and if the rash has spread in the skin, he shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious disease. So, quarantine, isolation, best way to stop the spread of infectious things. So to protect other people and prevent the spread of infection, patients were under a testing and lockdown regime until recovered. Quarantine conditions were quite rigorous. Same chapter, verse 45 and 46. The person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes. Let his hair be unkempt. Cover the lower part of his face masks, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone. He must live outside the camp. Notice in here, unclean must mean infectious. The social isolation there, you were visibly infectious by wearing raggy old clothes and probably looking like a street beggar, but also wearing a face mask is quite interesting. And you also had to cry out, infectious, infectious, keep away. Would have been very embarrassing. When the infectious person was fully recovered, they were to wash and shave themselves and wash their clothing carefully. There was another 7-day period before complete restoration to normal household life. So turn over to chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. The person to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair and bathe with water, then he will be ceremonially clean. After this he may come into the camp, but he must stay outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day he must shave off all his hair. He must shave his head, his beard, his eyebrows and the rest of his hair. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water, and he will be clean. So very rigorous process of reintroduction back into the community, including being absolutely bald of all your body hair. But without the people having a clue of the science of all this, epidemics would be kept in check and lives saved. So that's one area of infection. What about wounds and body discharges? They were to be treated as infectious and required washing and a period of quarantine. People in contact with those with discharges were also to wash and be isolated. No PPE, I imagine, in those days, but lots of this, hand washing. Let's read Leviticus chapter 15. I'll read the first 11 verses. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has a bodily discharge, the discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean. This is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness." Now put this into your COVID measures that are happening everywhere. Any bed the man with the discharge lies on will be unclean, and anything he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whoever sits on anything that the man with the discharge sat on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, I imagine that's referring to sneezing or coughing, that person must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Everything the man sits on when riding will be unclean, and whoever touches any of the things that were under him will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up those things must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Anyone the man with the discharge touches without rinsing his hands with water must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Absolute, complete understanding by the lawmaker here of how to prevent the spread of infection. There were also regulations for those who came in contact with a corpse. Turn over to the next book, Numbers, the 4th book of the Bible, and we're just going to read 2 verses out of this chapter. This is a very short verse, Numbers 19, verse 11. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. I don't think undertakers would have managed in the modern sense that we have undertaking businesses in those days. So 7 days isolation and 2 washings were required. Funerals were very much family affairs, not done by professionals as far as I understand. Other regulations applied if people touched carcasses, touched bones or graves. Just run down to verse 16. Anyone out in the open who touches someone who has been killed with a sword, or someone who has died a natural death, or anyone who touches a human bone or a grave will be unclean for 7 days. Again, to prevent the spread of anything infectious about the carcass or the bone or about the grave. So God was quite rigorous in the provisions that he made for them. So God's law emphasizes washing of hands and washing food, regular use of running water, contaminated implements being scoured before use or sometimes broken. So back to Leviticus chapter 11. I'm going to read you some more verses out of Leviticus chapter 11. I'm going to read verses 29 to 38. Of the animals that move around on the ground, these are unclean for you: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article, whatever its use, will be unclean, whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Put it in water, It will be unclean till evening, and then it will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a pot is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. I find that all quite fascinating. But again, it's the understanding that diseases can be carried by animals and insects that come into contact with us as people. And so these measures would promote good health, a safe public health environment, and prevent epidemics. So I want to tell you about this man, Dr. Semmelweis, who is a 19th century doctor. He discovered in 1847 that hand washing reduces deaths after surgery. And here's his story. I'm quoting Wikipedia here. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician and scientist, now known as the early pioneer of antiseptic procedures. Described as the savior of mothers, Semmelweis discovered that the incidence of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, could be drastically cut by the use of hand disinfection in obstetrical clinics. Semmelweis proposed the practice of washing hands with chlorinated lime solutions in 1847 while working in Vienna General Hospital's first obstetrical clinic, where doctors' wards had 3 times the mortality of midwives' wards. Despite various publications of results where hand washing reduced mortality to below 1%, Semmelweis's observations conflicted with the established scientific and medical opinions of the time, and his ideas were rejected by the medical community. Nothing's new, is it? He could offer no acceptable scientific explanation for his findings, and some doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands, and they mocked him for it. Semmelweis's practice earned widespread acceptance only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory, and Joseph Lister, acting on the French microbiologist's research, practiced and operated using hygienic methods with great success. Poor Dr. Semmelweis, disregarded, but note that's 19th century, the first discovery of the science behind God's law about 1,500 years before Jesus Christ. The next area I want to look at is food safety. And we're going to have a little wee science lesson here as well. Some animals, fish and birds carry disease which can be transmitted to people. In Leviticus chapter 11, God provided simple classifications of acceptable foods. The laws were designed to guarantee food safety. The people were to eat what the translators call clean food. And here's a summary of the rules that God gave them. animals with a split hoof and that chewed the cud, fish with fins and scales, no birds of prey, creepy crawlies with jointed legs for hopping. And I found this beautiful picture on Google Images where you've got the split hoof in the first picture on the left, then you've got the cow chewing the cud, you've got the fish with scales and fins, and you've got a grasshopper with jointed legs. So they sound a bit bizarre, don't they? But they were simple, easy to remember rules that everyone could understand. You could teach your small child those rules. You didn't have to understand anything about science to know if something was going to be safe. So God's law definitely prohibited pork and some seafood. And when you think about it, without proper preparation and refrigeration, these could lead to intestinal problems and food poisoning. So here's a bit of science. Again, I'm quoting Wikipedia. Pork is known to carry some diseases such as pork tapeworm and trichinosis and pigbill. Thus, uncooked or undercooked pork can be dangerous to consume. Other microorganisms such as E. coli, Salmonella, and Staphylococcus aureus can be found in inadequately cooked pork, poultry, and other meats. So when God said to them, this animal does not fit the bill, he was protecting them from these potential results. And so I went down a little pathway about food safety. Laws controlling the production and marketing of food have existed since ancient times. The Code of Hammurabi makes several references to grain and cattle stocks, the former often being used as the currency of fines. So you would pay your fine with grain or cattle. Ancient Egypt carried laws on the labeling of wines, similar to those in existence today. Consumer protection laws were introduced in ancient Rome to minimize fraud and minimize the sale of poor quality food. The Bible makes many references to which foods should and should not be eaten. And there's the web reference for me finding that, where I found that. So Wikipedia again, food safety, it actually is a scientific qualification that you can have in the 21st century. It's used as a scientific discipline describing handling, preparation and storage of food in ways that prevent foodborne illness. We're a long way from the people of Israel camped in the desert, looking after their flocks or foraging for what they can find. Food safety science includes a number of routines that should be followed to avoid potential health hazards. So you all have been exposed to the ones about Salmonella particularly. In this way, food safety often overlaps with food defence to prevent harm to consumers. Food can transmit pathogens which can result in the illness or death of the person or other animals. The main mediums are bacteria, viruses, mould and fungus, which is Latin for mushroom. It can also serve as a growth and reproductive medium for pathogens. So then from there, you have this, what they call zoonosis. I think I'm saying that correctly. A zoonosis, plural zoonoses or zoonotic diseases, is an infectious disease caused by a pathogen, an infectious agent such as a bacterium, virus, parasite, or prion, that has jumped from a non-human animal, usually a vertebrate, to a human. Oh, COVID-19 overtones. Major modern diseases such as Ebola virus disease and salmonellosis are zoonoses. I didn't know that. Most strains of influenza that infect humans are human diseases, although many strains of bird flu and swine flu are zoonoses. These viruses occasionally recombine with human strains of the flu and can cause pandemics, such as the 1918 Spanish flu or the 2009 swine flu. Zoonoses can be caused by a range of disease pathogens, such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. This next bit I found quite interesting. Of 1,415 pathogens known to infect humans, 61% were zoonotic. Most human diseases originated in other animals. However, only diseases that routinely involve non-human to human transmission, such as rabies, are considered direct zoonoses. Thank you, Wikipedia. The H5N1 avian flu, SARS, and COVID-19 outbreaks can be traced to keeping live animals in wet markets where the potential for zoonotic transmission is greatly increased. In April 2020, scientist Peter Daszak described a Chinese wet market as follows. It is a bit of a shock to go to a wildlife market and see this huge diversity of animals live in cages on top of each other, with a pile of guts that have been pulled out of an animal and thrown on the floor. These are perfect places for viruses to spread. In a 2007 study, Chinese scientists identified the presence of SARS-CoV-like viruses in horseshoe bats, combined with unsanitary wildlife markets and the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China as a time bomb. And I found this picture really interesting, and I'll try and talk through it with you. Up in the top left is the bird, and this is the description of the genetic change that enables a flu strain to jump from one animal species to another, including humans. And it can happen in 3 ways. So the bird has an influenza strain, which you will see can pass directly to the woman in the picture. Or the flu strain can go on the far left of the picture directly down to the pig in the bottom of the picture. Or the flu strain can go into another intermediate host, an intermediate host, such as a chicken or a pig. Then the person can pass the human strain of a disease to the same chicken or pig. And if both viruses get to the same cell, the genes from the bird strain mix with genes from the human strain to yield a new strain. The new strain can spread from the intermediate host to humans, or it can go, see how on the outside of the picture on the left it's going bird, pig, human. So without undergoing genetic change, a bird strain of influenza A can jump directly from a duck or other aquatic bird to humans. And without undergoing a genetic change, a bird strain of influenza A can jump directly from a duck to an animal host and then to humans. So it can come directly to the human or via the pig or chicken to the human. Science lesson over. So we understand a bit about what God was doing by providing food safety requirements. So simple. You didn't have to know any of that science. God knew that some animals were less likely to transmit disease to the humans than other animals. So today we overcome that by correct storage. We understand the science of how we need to cook, how we need to wash things. All of those we know, but they didn't know 3,500 years ago. So another infection management that God has given rules about is mouldy buildings. Leviticus chapter 14, let's read verses 33 to 48. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan, which I'm giving you as your possession, and I put a spreading mildew in a house in that land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, I've seen something that looks like mildew in my house. The priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mildew, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mildew on the walls, and if it has greenish or reddish depressions that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out of the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must return to inspect the house. If the mildew has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside the town. Then they are to take other stones to replace these and take new clay and plaster the house. If the mildew reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and plastered, the priest is to go and examine it. And if the mildew has spread in the house, it is a destructive mildew. The house is unclean. It must be torn down. Its stones, timbers, and all the plaster and taken out of the town to an unclean place. Anyone who goes into the house while it is closed up will be unclean till evening. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash his clothes. But if the priest comes to examine it and the mildew has not spread after the house has been plastered, he shall pronounce the house clean because the mildew is gone. I've never seen anything like this picture. It appears to me that the house has been flooded for some time. I get the feeling that would be a pull-down job, but I'm not real sure. So, because people can become very unwell from moulds and mildew, this procedure was legislated for. It was to be inspected, quarantined, re-inspected, scraped down and replastered. If the mould proved untreatable, the house was to be torn down. Anyone in contact with the house was considered infectious and subject to quarantine. There were similar regulations about mildewed clothing. Chapter 13 to verses 40, starting at verse 47. If any clothing is contaminated with mildew, any woolen or linen clothing, any woven or knitted material of linen or wool, any leather or clothing made of leather, and if the contamination in the clothing or leather or woven or knitted material or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is a spreading mildew and must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the mildew and isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the seventh day he is to examine it, and if the mildew has spread in the clothing or the woven or knitted material or the leather, whatever its use, is a destructive mildew, the article is unclean. You must burn up the clothing or the woven or knitted material of wool or linen. Because the mildew is destructive, the article must be burned up. But if, when the priest examines it, the mildew has not spread in the clothing or the woven or knitted material or the leather article, he shall order that the contaminated article be washed. Then he is to isolate it for another 7 days. After the affected article has been washed, the priest is to examine it, and if the mildew has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. Burn it with fire, whether the mildew has affected one side or the other. If when the priest examines it, the mildew has faded after the article has been washed, he is to tear the contaminated part out of the clothing or the leather or the woven or knitted material. But if it reappears in the clothing, it is spreading, and whatever has the mildew must be burned with fire. The clothing or the woven or knitted material or leather, any leather article that has been washed and is rid of the mildew must be washed again, and it will be clean. So we probably can't imagine this today because of washing machines and everything being throwaways and all the hygienic controls that we have in our culture. But when I went looking about mould, I found this, Wikipedia again. Moulds are ubiquitous in the biosphere, and mould spores are a common component of household and workplace dust. The vast majority of moulds are not hazardous to humans, and reaction to moulds can vary between individuals, with relatively minor allergic reactions being the most common. Nonetheless, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported in June 2006, this report was called Mold Prevention Strategies and Possible Health Effects in the Aftermath of Hurricanes and Major Floods. They said this: excessive exposure to mold contaminated materials can cause adverse health effects in susceptible persons, regardless of the type of mold or the extent of contamination. When mold spores are present in abnormally high quantities, they can present especially hazardous health risks to humans after prolonged exposure, including allergic reactions or poisoning by mycotoxins or causing fungal infection, mycosis. And of course, if you lived in these type of conditions, you are exposed for high quantities over a long period of time. So yet again, God is protecting them from those bad health consequences. Sanitation. Until recent times, it was common for excrement to be dumped into the streets. There are many countries where this still happens. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever take a heavy toll of lives, but not in Israel. Turn over to the next book after Numbers, Deuteronomy, chapter 23. We're going to find chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, verses 12 to 14. Designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with. And when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy, so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you. There's not much you cannot find in the Bible, that's for sure. So those were the 4 topics that I chose to look at. We could have looked at mental health issues that can be ameliorated by faith in God, but I decided I would just stick with these practical issues for today. And I want to share this quote from you, from some person or other. Although the Bible is not a medical text, its historical accounts, laws and precepts, and even its wording yield an abundant harvest of information concerning the structure of the human body, diseases, injuries, cures, and above all, preventive and sanitary procedures. The material contained in some portions of the, here's a new word maybe, Pentateuch, which is, Pent means 5, so it's the first 5 books of the Bible. The material contained in some portions of God's law given through Moses to Israel is so factual that even the sophisticated present-day student cannot help but be amazed at what he reads there. And you can find that book online because I went searching and found it yesterday. And there's another thing 3 pages later. The main emphasis is not put on therapy, but on preventive medicine and physical and mental hygiene as applied to the individual, the family, the people, and society in general. Prominent in biblical law are methods of diagnosing infectious diseases, the prevention of epidemics, and the introduction of a weekly day of rest, not only for each Israelite, but for aliens living in the land of Israel, as well as for servants and even domestic animals. Master, servant, and cattle alike were subject to laws of labor hygiene. So, summary of the Bible and public health. Thousands of years ago, God gave a national law to the people of Israel. The law regulated public health, epidemic prevention, infection management, food safety, mold elimination, public sanitation. The measures were centuries ahead of developments in scientific knowledge. The measures were simple to follow and quite different to those of the neighbouring nations. However, the creator of the world provided, way ahead of their time, public health laws for his people. And anyone could copy those. Maybe the nations around observed less of this or that disease, or less of this or that infection or pandemic. Did they have pandemics then? And maybe those nations came and said, what do you guys do that's different to what we do? I don't know, I'm speculating. But God's law has been now scientifically proved to be spot on. So trust him. Thank you for joining today. Seminars are online Thursdays, 12:30 New Zealand time. Here's the web reference. God willing, next week, the topic for Seminar 9, 2 Crowns, Introducing Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening. You can find earlier seminars in this series on this web address.